With just 3 laps remaining in Singapore, Hamilton's Ferrari suddenly stopped obeying. His braking power collapsed. Deceleration dropped from over 4.5 Gs to barely 3, and the onboard cameras showed a driver fighting physics more than rivals. The FIA still handed him a 5-second penalty for track limits, a cruel twist for a man who physically couldn't slow the car. But the true story wasn't the penalty, it was what came afterward. In the hours that followed, Riccardo Adami, Hamilton's trusted race engineer, became the reluctant centre of Ferrari's storm. His radio reassurances during the race, "Cross the brakes, they will return," now rang hollow. And behind closed doors, Adami acknowledged what Hamilton had been screaming with every missed apex: the SF25 wasn't overheating. It was collapsing under a flaw baked into its design. That revelation, passed through leaks into the Italian press and whispered across the paddock, turned a single DNF risk into a full-blown organisational scandal. For the first time since Hamilton signed with Ferrari, the narrative shifted from adaptation struggles to betrayal. A star driver had trusted a legendary team, only to discover they'd gambled with a car they already knew carried weaknesses. What ignited the drama wasn't the visible sparks off the left front. It was Adami's quiet recognition that the brake collapse wasn't random, wasn't unforeseeable, and wasn't something Hamilton could have driven around. In Formula One, when the engineer's voice betrays doubt, the entire team feels it. And at Maranello, that doubt quickly spread like fire. The cameras caught Hamilton fighting to finish. The headlines the next morning caught Ferrari fighting to contain leaks. And the whisper that started inside Hamilton's garage would soon grow into the biggest internal crisis the team has faced since their last title drought deepened. What Adami admitted behind closed doors was not the kind of routine debrief engineers usually share. According to leaks that reached Italian and British outlets just days after the Singapore Grand Prix, Ferrari's own data confirmed that Hamilton's failure was born from a structural defect. The SF25's brake cooling system, designed to maximise aerodynamic efficiency, simply couldn't handle the sustained load of a street circuit. At Marina Bay, cars spend nearly 2/3 of the lap below 200 km/h, meaning natural airflow through the ducts is minimal. Temperatures that should stabilise near 1,000 degrees Celsius were spiking to nearly 1,200 on Hamilton's left front. The imbalance, over 150 degrees hotter than the opposite wheel, was catastrophic. Numbers don't lie. This wasn't a question of Hamilton pushing too hard or missing his marks. It was a car unable to breathe. Adami's words carried even more weight because he's not just any voice in Hamilton's ear. He is the man Ferrari assigned to bridge the trust gap between Maranello and their new star signing, the one meant to translate engineering into confidence. When he quietly acknowledged that the issue had been flagged in simulations months earlier, and that no structural changes were made before the season, the paddock understood the magnitude. This wasn't mechanical bad luck. It was a decision, a deliberate trade-off that prioritised aerodynamic gain over reliability, with the hope that the weakness would never surface on race day. But it did, and on the worst possible stage. The fallout was instant. Rival engineers were already dissecting Ferrari's brake duct design, wondering how far the limits had been pushed. The FIA, faced with footage of Hamilton's glowing front left disc, requested internal temperature data. And within Ferrari itself, whispers grew louder. Had senior technical leaders ignored their own simulations? Or worse, had they gambled on Hamilton's reputation to carry a flawed design past scrutiny? In Formula One, failures can be forgiven. But a revelation from inside the garage that the team knowingly ignored a structural weakness? That crosses into betrayal. And once the trust between a driver and his engineer cracks, it rarely heals. What began as Hamilton's brake collapse on lap 60 was no longer about one race. It was about whether Ferrari's most important signing in a generation had already lost faith in the red machine. The words that left Hamilton's garage didn't stay contained within it. Within 48 hours, an anonymous engineer from Ferrari's technical department spoke to Italian media, and the picture became even darker. According to this whistleblower, the SF25's brake cooling system had been flagged before the car ever turned a wheel in pre-season. The simulations at Maranello showed overheating risks on low-speed circuits where airflow is restricted, but leadership chose not to redesign the chassis ducts. The reasoning? A redesign would compromise the aero balance they believed was crucial to fight Red Bull and McLaren on high-speed tracks. The revelation landed like a bomb. It wasn't just that Ferrari had a weakness. Every team has them. It was that the weakness was knowingly built into the car, And Hamilton, their marquee signing, had been the one to pay the price in front of the world. The timing made it worse. After months of adaptation struggles, Singapore had been billed internally as the weekend where Hamilton could finally fight near the front again. Instead, his car betrayed him, and his engineer's quiet admission removed any doubt about why. Inside Maranello, tension spiked. Senior figures in the aerodynamic group reportedly clashed with those in thermal simulation. Some pointed fingers at leadership for pushing an aggressive Aero philosophy at the expense of reliability. Others accused the design office of failing to escalate the severity of the risk. And at the centre of it all stood Hamilton, the driver whose career move to Ferrari was supposed to symbolise rebirth, not regression. The leak forced Ferrari into defensive mode. Team principal Frédéric Vasseur called for an internal review of structural verification and brake design, but the damage was already spreading. In the paddock, rivals smelled blood. Mercedes engineers, still closely tracking their former driver, noted how eerily similar this was to Ferrari's 2017 cooling miscalculations. Red Bull strategists openly speculated whether Ferrari could even survive the upcoming triple header without a brake upgrade. For Hamilton, the consequences ran deeper than any technical bulletin. Once the paddock believed Ferrari had gambled with a known flaw, the unspoken question became unavoidable. If they hid this, what else haven't they told him? And that question, whispered from inside his own garage, was about to fracture the very relationship meant to carry Ferrari back to glory. When Lewis Hamilton signed for Ferrari, Riccardo Adami was more than just a technical appointment. He was chosen as the bridge, the engineer with experience guiding world-class drivers tasked with making the seven-time champion feel understood inside Maranello. At Singapore, that bridge cracked under the weight of disbelief. The radio messages tell the story. Lap 60, I've lost the left front. Hamilton's delivery was calm, but the words carried the urgency of a driver feeling his car physically collapse beneath him. Adami's response, cross the brakes, they will return, was the standard reassurance. But Hamilton's reply wasn't. I am not trying to cut the circuit, mate. That single sentence cut deeper than any telemetry printout. It wasn't frustration at a 5-second penalty. It was the sound of a driver who felt his own engineer didn't grasp the reality inside the cockpit. In Formula One, trust between driver and engineer is sacred. Every braking marker, every lift and coast instruction, every undercut gamble is filtered through that bond. When the driver doubts that his engineer believes him, strategy collapses. It becomes a fracture no technical fix can immediately heal. Cameras caught Hamilton climbing out of the SF-25 after the race. His body language said everything. Helmet still on, gloves stripped off with sharp movements, a shake of the head toward the pit wall. Adami, normally close at hand, kept his distance. Within Ferrari's garage, silence carried heavier weight than words. Insiders later described the post-race debrief as cold, with Hamilton giving short factual feedback rather than the detailed driver input teams rely on to diagnose failures. For a team like Ferrari, the implications are dangerous. When a champion of Hamilton's caliber feels unheard, he starts to adapt his own strategy mid-race, relying on instinct rather than instructions. That independence can win races, but it can also dismantle team unity. Adami's quiet admission to colleagues that the failure had been foreseen only sharpened the contrast. In public, the engineer had reassured. In private, he confirmed Hamilton's worst fears. And so the real crisis wasn't the brake collapse itself, it was the breakdown of communication between cockpit and pit wall. Because if Hamilton stops believing the voice in his ear, Ferrari will find themselves fighting not just Red Bull and McLaren, but the slow erosion of their most critical relationship. The leak from Hamilton's side of the garage was the first tremor. The aftershocks inside Maranello were far more violent. Within days of Singapore, Italian newspapers were reporting tense meetings between Ferrari's aerodynamic group, thermal simulation department, and race operations. What had been whispered as a brake issue was now being labelled by insiders as a cultural failure. And in Formula One, culture eats technology for breakfast. Senior staff in the simulation office were furious. According to reports, they had flagged the brake cooling issue back in January, when computational fluid dynamics predicted heat loads nearly 15% above safety margins on street circuits. The design office, however, had insisted that widening the ducts would cost 3 points of aero efficiency, the equivalent of almost 0.2 per lap at high-speed tracks like Monza. That 0.2 had been deemed worth more than the safety margin. Singapore proved the cost of that gamble. The political lines were quickly drawn. Some in the technical group defended the Aero first philosophy, arguing that Red Bull's dominance could only be challenged by aggressive efficiency gains. Others accused leadership of repeating Ferrari's oldest mistake, gambling on a single design philosophy while ignoring reliability warnings. For Frédéric Vasseur, the team principal who had promised Hamilton a modern Ferrari, the optics were disastrous. He was forced to announce an internal review of structural validation, with whispers of a mid-season reshuffle in key departments. The whispers didn't stop there. Rival teams were quick to fan the flames. McLaren insiders hinted that Ferrari could face further thermal collapses in Suzuka and Mexico, where braking loads are similarly brutal. Mercedes engineers suggested Ferrari might need emergency duct redesigns, a project that could take 6 weeks, far too late to save their season. Inside Ferrari's garage, the atmosphere grew colder. Hamilton's disappointment was obvious, but even Charles Leclerc reportedly expressed concern that a fundamental weakness had been ignored. For a team already walking the tightrope of managing 2 alpha drivers, the perception of negligence was poison. Ferrari has survived scandals before, but this one wasn't about outsiders or politics in the FIA. It came from inside, from Hamilton's own engineer and a whistleblower who chose exposure over silence. And that kind of crack doesn't heal quickly. The question now was whether Vasseur could contain the damage before Ferrari's entire 2025 project unraveled under the weight of its own secrecy. In Formula One, every failure is measured not just in seconds but in points. Hamilton's collapse in Singapore wasn't just about humiliation under the floodlights. It was about the swing in the championship that followed. Going into the weekend, Ferrari trailed Mercedes by only 4 points in the constructors' standings. Hamilton himself sat just 19 points behind George Russell, with an outside chance of clawing back momentum in the final stretch. The 5-second penalty, combined with the brake failure, dropped him from what could have been 8th place down to the edge of irrelevance. That's 4 critical points gone. And a net swing of 7 once Mercedes banked Russell's podium? 4 points may sound small, but at this stage of the season, 4 points are the difference between hope and surrender. McLaren's double points haul at Singapore only widened the noose, moving them 16 points clear of Ferrari. More importantly, it forced a recalculation inside every garage. If Ferrari cannot survive a high-deg circuit without their brakes unraveling, where can they realistically score in the triple header? Look ahead, and the calendar turns merciless. Suzuka, with its long, sweeping corners, punishes poor aero balance. Austin's stop-start sequence generates brutal thermal loads. Mexico, perched at altitude, exposes every weakness in cooling efficiency. If Ferrari's ducts are flawed, the next 3 races don't just threaten points, they threaten survival. For Hamilton, the Singapore result meant more than just numbers. It symbolized the collapse of a redemption arc. His move to Ferrari was sold as the pathway to an 8th world title, the final chapter of a legendary career. Instead, he's now watching rivals like Russell and Norris carve into Verstappen's lead, while his own campaign drifts towards statistical impossibility. Unless Ferrari can claw back double-digit points in the next 2 rounds, Hamilton will be mathematically reduced to a supporting role. And that's the bitterest twist. Singapore wasn't simply a race lost. It was the moment Ferrari's title challenge tilted off-axis, leaving them vulnerable not just to their rivals' pace, but to the perception that they had gambled away Hamilton's trust for a handful of aero points. The standings tell the story, the whispers tell the rest, and together they point to a truth Ferrari cannot afford to ignore. The Singapore brake collapse was the headline, but inside the paddock, few saw it as a one-off. For many, it was just the latest chapter in Ferrari's long, frustrating cycle. Moments of brilliance undone by institutional inertia. From the outside, Ferrari remains the most glamorous badge in Formula One. But from the inside, the cracks look painfully familiar. Engineers who have worked at Maranello describe a culture where hierarchy often outweighs technical evidence. Decisions cascade down from leadership, and dissent rarely travels upward. The brake cooling compromise that crippled Hamilton wasn't just a technical miscalculation. It was a cultural reflex. Protect the philosophy, protect the prestige, and hope the weaknesses don't get exposed. The same pattern haunted Ferrari in 2010, when a conservative strategy call in Abu Dhabi cost Fernando Alonso a championship. It haunted them again in 2017 and 2018, when Sebastian Vettel's title pushes unraveled under pressure and technical missteps. The numbers prove the consistency of the failure. Since 2008, Ferrari has delivered 15 different chassis, 6 separate team principals, and 0 championships. Each car has shown flashes of speed, but none has carried the resilience required across a full season. The SF25 was supposed to break that cycle, armed with Hamilton's experience and Vasseur's steady leadership. Instead, Singapore proved the cycle remains intact: high expectations, internal silos, and a collapse under scrutiny. For Hamilton, this cultural disease presents a unique danger. He arrived at Ferrari with the aura of a driver who elevates teams. At Mercedes, his collaboration with Bono and the engineering corps created a dynasty built on trust and feedback loops. At Ferrari, he's confronted with a structure where simulations flag risks, engineers raise concerns, but design philosophy prevails anyway. For a champion accustomed to precision and adaptation, it feels like déjà vu from the darker years of his career. Only this time, the team's badge magnifies every flaw. The danger is not simply losing points. It's losing Hamilton's belief that Ferrari can evolve faster than the culture that drags it back. Because once a driver of his caliber decides the system won't change, history shows he stops waiting for it to. And Singapore's leak didn't just reveal a design flaw, it revealed a culture that still hasn't learned how to bury its ghosts. Ferrari now stands at a crossroads that feels eerily familiar, yet uniquely urgent. The Singapore Grand Prix wasn't just another night race gone wrong. It was a moment that exposed the foundation of their 2025 project, and the road ahead offers no time for recovery in silence. In the immediate term, Ferrari faces two parallel battles. One is technical, redesigning brake ducts and cooling architecture without compromising the SF25's Aero profile. That kind of structural change typically takes 6 weeks of simulation and wind tunnel validation. Yet the calendar is merciless. Suzuka, Austin, and Mexico arrive within 4. Every lap in those circuits will punish the exact weakness Ferrari can't yet fix. Unless emergency measures are found, larger duct inserts, revised caliper cooling, Hamilton and Leclerc risk driving wounded cars in every session. The second battle is psychological. Hamilton came to Ferrari not just to race, but to believe. His trust was shaken in Singapore, not only by the failure, but by the revelation that the weakness was known internally. Rebuilding that bond with his engineer, and with Vasseur's leadership, will define whether Ferrari's season collapses into recrimination or rallies into resilience. Drivers don't forget when their safety and competitiveness are compromised. Hamilton's tone after the race was restrained, but insiders described it as controlled fury. Once that erupts publicly, Ferrari will face a storm far worse than sparks on a front left disc. And looming above it all is the championship picture. Each lost point hands momentum to rivals. Each rumour of resignations feeds a perception of chaos. And each internal leak makes Hamilton's move look less like destiny and more like a miscalculation. Ferrari wanted him as the symbol of a rebirth. Instead, after Singapore, he risks becoming the emblem of another false dawn. The road ahead is brutally clear. Ferrari must fix the car, repair the trust, and rewrite the narrative, all within weeks. Because if they don't, the season won't be remembered for Verstappen's title defence or McLaren's rise. It will be remembered for Hamilton's first year in red collapsing into the same old story. Ferrari's promise, Ferrari's failure.